Hey everybody, it's Larson Edson. Today let's talk about accounts of living mammoths. The mainline narrative of history is that mammoths and mastodons died out a minimum of several thousand years ago, and yet written and oral accounts, anatomically accurate descriptions, and vivid encounters of mammoths or mastodons have been shared within the past several decades. Let's examine these accounts in this video. Our first case may be examined by considering the book Beyond the Mississippi by Albert Richardson. This book was published in 1867 and had been written several years prior based on Albert Richardson's experience in the western United States. On page 202, we're given the following anecdote as something of a throwaway line, and yet the manner in which it's woven within the story as a natural little detail of simply what happened is really intriguing to me, at least. Let's read it. At the South Platte crossing, where our road struck the old immigrant trail from the Missouri to Salt Lake, we found several lodges of Sioux Indians who termed our mail coach the paper wagon, the little log post office the paper house, and our driver the king of mules. Among thousands of returning immigrants, we passed one jovial party with a huge charcoal sketch of an elephant upon their wagon cover, labeled "What We Saw at Pike's Peak." This is quite an amazing, small, but highly valuable encounter, in my opinion, because it seems like something of a casual line that would be shared by a traveler. Kind of like if you were taking a road trip and you saw an interesting bumper sticker or a car that you liked, and you just threw it in your journal or in your video diary as just a small little detail and a part of life that was almost expected on the road. Now, it also carries something of an air of common knowledge and a lack of surprise. Richardson doesn't seem particularly shocked at all that these Sioux Indian immigrants who he encounters as he heads west claim to have seen what looks like an elephant in the vicinity of Pikes Peak, Colorado, which is obviously the Rocky Mountain region. This drives us to raise some questions and to have some reasonable speculation about exactly what Richardson knew, what the American Indians who he encountered knew, and what the culture of the time had as something like what we might call common knowledge or cultural understanding. As we're about to see in some of these other accounts in the next few minutes, there appears to be something of a shared knowledge and an acceptance among both the First Nations individuals, the American Indians, and the Westerners, whether they be trappers or pilgrims and homesteaders or explorers or soldiers. There seems to be something that they are all on the same page about for the most part, and Richardson seems to be part of it, in that there are, or at least were, mountains in the West, which we would now call the Rocky Mountain Range, which were home to large elephants, or to what we would now call mammoths or mastodons. And I say this because we're about to examine some cases in which the First Nations individuals say exactly this and make this precise claim about the regions around the Rocky Mountains, and then later about these mammoths fleeing to the Rocky Mountain region. And this doesn't seem that remarkable to Richardson. It's not a line that he sees need to dive deep into. He doesn't seem shocked by it. He doesn't even jot down any wondering about why they might know what an elephant is and claim to have seen one at Pikes Peak. It just seems like almost like it's natural. Like he might react to them claiming that they saw a mammoth in the Rocky Mountains the same way that he might have reacted if they claimed to see a moose or a bison or a large bear or a wolf. It just seems like he recognizes that they claim to see this animal, and it's unremarkable to him. A last point on this first story is that the Sioux Indian immigrants, which are the group that is encountered here by Albert Richardson, of 1859, that is when this particular entry seems to have been written. So around the 1850s to 1860s, the Sioux Indians seem to have known exactly what an elephant would look like. Now, they might not have called it an elephant or a mammoth or a mastodon, but they know what it would have looked like enough that they could draw one that a Westerner who also knows what they look like would recognize it as exactly what it was. So this is interesting because for the most part, there's not much reason that a Sioux Indian individual or a group of Sioux Indians would or should know what elephants are or what they look like when they're alive enough to draw one. According to mainstream science, the only elephants that should have been alive at the time are those of Africa and Asia. Now, it's not entirely impossible that a Westerner could have gotten out to the unsettled western regions of the United States and shared perhaps a description or some drawn images of these elephants from faraway lands. That is potentially possible, but it seems fairly unlikely. It then seems to be another step into unlikeliness that these Sioux Indians, for some reason, would take that knowledge that some Westerner has shared with them about what elephants look like, and then would depict some kind of a joke or a hoax on their wagon and claim to have seen one in Pikes Peak, in the vicinity of Pikes Peak in the Rocky Mountains. Now, when we examine what we're about to examine, which is these other supporting claims that there are indeed, or at least at the time were, mammoths in the region, it seems like that is much more likely of a scenario that they are claiming to see exactly what their people and surrounding peoples claim to see in the region versus the scenario where a Westerner goes there, gives them knowledge and a general understanding of these creatures, and then they stage a hoax or a joke or something like that. And before anyone says this in the comments, I don't think that it's really fair to expect that Sioux Indians who may have seen parts of mammoth skeletons, if they were lucky, which is possible, would really know what a living mammoth would look like with skin on it. Alright, our next encounter comes from Life in the Far West by author George Frederick Augustus Ruxton. In his encounter, he is describing how he and a group of companions traveled down from Idaho to the Great Salt Lake region in Utah. Now, at the time, the Great Salt Lake was much bigger. The water levels were higher than they are today, creating several islands which are no longer there today. Or they are there, but they are no longer islands. They're rather just pieces of land. And I'll get into that in just a little bit. But for now, we'll dive into a page where he's talking about the Great Salt Lake region, and he is speaking of a companion of his named Rube. Rube declared to his companions that the larger island, that's an island on the Great Salt Lake, that the larger island was known by the Indians to be inhabited by a race of giants with whom no communication had ever been held by mortal men. And but for the casual wafting up to the shores of the lake of logs of gigantic trees cut by axes of extraordinary size, the world would never have known that such people existed. They were, moreover, white as themselves, and lived upon corn and fruits, and rode on elephants. Alright, so here we have a claim that was shared in approximately 1849 from a group that claims knowledge, again, cultural knowledge from the surrounding region, from these adventurers and trappers and explorers and First Nations individuals, that there was a group or a race of Caucasian, of white giants who lived on an island, and on this island they ate corn and fruits, and they also possessed and used as means of transportation large elephants. Now, this is extremely significant because this takes place in the same region of the Rocky Mountains, and what we'll see later on is that the claim of the surrounding First Nations individuals is that these elephants lived on the plains and were later driven up to hide away in the mountains based on hunting. Now, obviously, as I have stated, the state of the Great Salt Lake is sadly in great decline today, and it has been for several decades. Now, at the time of this experience, which was in the early 1800s and then published in 1849, the Great Salt Lake was much, much bigger. The water level was raised, there were more islands, and using the islands, or rather using the description of the islands from this piece, we can actually find almost with certainty exactly what island these giants are claimed to have inhabited. and that is going to be shown right here. So first I want to show you a quick time lapse of through the years how the Great Salt Lake has receded. And going back to the oldest Google Earth image that I can access, we can actually see exactly where the water line is around this island. Now this island is described as being in the northwest section in the book of the Great Salt Lake, and at the time this would have been the northwest section, and it is said that it almost cuts off and separates the northwest section of the lake, and as we see here, it indeed does almost do that. Then we see that there is another island in close proximity described by the author. This island is said to be about 12 miles from the shore, and this island is said to be the smaller of the two. Now if we look in close proximity, we do see the smaller of the two islands right here, and if we can about guesstimate where the shoreline would have been had this been filled with water, it is indeed right in the region of 12 miles from shore. So according to the First Nations individuals and the Western adventurers who were in the region, this island right here is an island that used to be inhabited by white giants, and white meaning not like white like snow, but white as in Caucasian, because they're said to be white just like the party that was being addressed in the book, and these were white Westerners. So Caucasian giants who possessed and rode on elephants. Now this is something that I would love to explore in a road trip or another video, and maybe I will get to it someday, or maybe one of you will. Alright, time for a few other encounters that I've been able to just find shared various places across the internet, and these are from written accounts, again, of First Nations stories and of Western explorers. David Thompson of 1811, this is his first-hand account in which he, as a British Canadian explorer and fur trader, was crossing the Athabasca Pass in the Alberta Rockies, again, the Rocky Mountain chain, which we see popping up again and again as the place where these mammoths fled to avoid hunting and ultimately persecution at the hands of the First Nations individuals who were hunting them. He was crossing the Athabasca Pass in the Alberta Rockies with his crew and discovered large tracks in the snow described as circular footprints 14 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 4 large toes and short claws. The native guide who was accompanying him identified them as belonging to a young woolly mammoth estimated to be 18 feet high, which he said frequented the Athabasca headwaters and slept upright against trees. In 1889, Cole F. Fowler shared a second-hand report from a fur trader, and he says that, according to this fur trader who Fowler spoke to, there was a small group of mammoths near the headwaters of the Snake River in Alaska, and the Inuit hunters in 1887 had killed a portion of the small herd with their muskets, including an old bull and a cow. And the creature's tusks were showed to Fowler, and they did indeed, according to him, have fresh blood and flesh still attached to the base of the tusks. Sketches depicted them as woolly mammoths. Interestingly, in these sketches, the mammoths had 4 tusks rather than 2. Now, this is interesting because the fact that certain subspecies of mammoths had 4 tusks was not confirmed and known to science at the time. However, now we do know that such a group of mammoths did indeed exist, although it's thought to have existed long before when these men claim to have seen and fought and killed some of them. Here's another account from the 1800s. In 1803, the Hudson's Bay Company employee named Thomas Pollock said that while he was on a mission in Western Canada with his guide, he suddenly encountered an enormous animal approximately 20 feet in height. He described it as having a very heavy and unwieldy appearance with an enormous belly nearly touching the ground and a dirty black color to its coat. Now, as vague descriptions go, this one actually seems pretty open to it being a mammoth. Now, it's about 20 feet tall. That seems in the region of being correct, depending on whether it was a male or female mammoth. He says that it was a dirty black color. Again, this fits with the general description of what this fur might look like after having lived through and moved through the underbrush, perhaps rolling or bathing in mud, potentially as other elephants have done. So this fits. And then the other thing that fits is calling it unwieldy, so kind of this heavy, slow moving, non-agile appearance. That seems to fit. And the biggest hint we have here is that he claims that it had a massive belly, that's a check mark, and that it was almost touching the ground. Now, if you were to see something like this, and it had hair hanging down who knows how far from the belly, perhaps inches from the ground, perhaps a little bit more than inches from the ground, perhaps a foot, 2 feet, or 3 feet from the ground, you would indeed describe it as a large belly that appears to be almost touching the ground. Now, in truth, what it was probably that was almost touching the ground is more so the hair from the belly from this woolly mammoth rather than the belly itself. But if you were terrified and having a brief encounter before you fled on foot, I think it's absolutely fair to say that this belly was almost touching the ground. Now, if it were something like an African elephant, it might not be as realistic to expect such a description. However, if you throw woolly mammoth fur onto an African elephant, which lowers its belly by a significant margin, then indeed it would appear that that belly's almost at ground level, even though the creature itself is about 20 feet tall. According to Alexander Ross, some of the Upper Cree, a tribe who inhabited the country in the vicinity of the Athabasca River, have a curious tradition with respect to the animals which they state formerly frequented the mountains. They allege that these animals were of frightful magnitude, being from 200 to 300 feet in length and high in proportion, that they formerly lived in the plains, a great distance to the eastward, from which they were gradually driven by the Indians to the Rocky Mountains, that they destroyed all smaller animals, and, if their agility was equal to their size, would have also destroyed all of the natives. And one man has asserted that his grandfather told him he saw one of these animals in a mountain pass where he was hunting, and that on hearing its roar, which he compared to a loud thunder, the sight almost left his eyes, and his heart became as small as an infant's. Now, obviously, the size here is either mistranslated or miscommunicated, or it is an exaggeration. And either one of these seems significantly likely to me. So whether this is a poor translation or simply a miscommunication of the units of measurement, so perhaps they were talking about something closer to inches, but the Westerner thought they were saying feet, or perhaps they were doing what people are prone to do, which is to exaggerate size. And we could do this for the previous story as well. If the individual said that he thought it was about 20 feet tall, well, perhaps the real creature in question was 13 to 15 feet tall, and due to his panic and the fact that a huge creature kind of makes us start to lose our sense of exactly how huge is. These are things that can happen to humans. I remember one time I saw a bull moose in the woods of Colorado, and it would be really hard to estimate the size because I just remember being taken aback by how absolutely massive it was. Now, did that massive mean that it was 8 feet tall at the shoulder, or 7 feet tall, or 10 feet tall at the shoulder? I don't know, and if I were just retelling the story, I might be wrong by several feet, because massive to me is just massive at some point, and this happens to people. However, the point is that he saw something that was absolutely huge. So again, if this was a 13-foot tall mammoth and not a 20-foot tall mammoth, I don't really think that changes the story much at all for any relevant intents or purposes that we are examining it from here today. Similarly, whether this is a mistranslation about them being 200 to 300 feet long, or whether this is just someone through oral tradition exaggerating size, either way, the kind of core of the story is that these massive creatures with a very loud roar, or as we would know with elephants, this is more like their kind of a bugling, trumpeting sound, that these moved from the plains into the Rocky Mountain region due to the hunting of the First Nations individuals. Now, this is relevant because most of the mammoth accounts that we have from the modern day are from the northwestern Yukon and Alaska territory, and or from the Rocky Mountain region in the southern 48 states of the United States. Now, as another anecdote, I have heard one-offs from individuals in my own research who, to the modern day, have claimed that they've seen mammoths in the Rocky Mountain region. There's one high school teacher specifically who I can think of who swears that he saw a mammoth while he was in the Colorado Rockies. Now, when we look at the regions where these are claimed to have taken place, we see that these are extremely low populations of humans per square mile, and these are absolutely massive regions, which, for all of the dietary needs, could absolutely sustain something like a mammoth. And indeed, we know it did sustain something like a mammoth in time gone by. Now, whether or not there is or was in recent history a surviving small herd or perhaps a handful of small herds of mammoths in the Rocky Mountain chain and in the northern Yukon or the Nahanni Valley region is yet to be seen. I think it is still possible, and I think it is highly possible that they were alive at least until recent history, recent being within the last 50 to 100 years. To give a bit of an idea of this, let's remember that there is considerable reason to believe, as Forrest Galente has pointed out, that there are actually surviving New Zealand moose still in the rural and lowly populated regions of New Zealand. Now, New Zealand, if we overlay it here, is significantly smaller than the portions of land that we're talking about here. And a moose, while not being the size of a mammoth, is an absolutely massive animal. So if a small breeding population of moose has managed to survive undetected for many decades in New Zealand, well, then it is possible, I think, to say that a small herd, or perhaps 2, 3, or 5 small herds scattered between the Rockies and the Yukon, have survived of living mammoths, at least until recent history, if not till this very day. Most of these regions are not accessible by any sort of paved roads. Most of them don't even have dirt or gravel roads, and the only way in or out is by horse, off-road vehicle, or perhaps a pontoon plane. The populations here are already absolutely tiny compared to what we are used to in the lower 48 and in most of the civilized Western world. And here I use the word civilized not so much to speak to anything moral, but more so to speak about the fact that in much of the Western world, nature has been either outright eradicated or completely tamed and limited to parks or reserves or zoos or animals that can and do literally live in your own house with you. And to go further here, this small population that lives in the Yukon Territory and even in the American Rockies is even smaller than we might guesstimate, because most of the population that is counted as living in these territories lives in a handful of towns and small cities, which are also in those territories. The vast majority of this population of humans in these territories is nowhere near the wilderness sections that we're talking about, which these creatures are alleged to inhabit. As far as aerial sightings go, we have basically two groups. We have the large passenger jets, which fly at between 20 and 35,000 feet, and these are not going to see anything with the naked eye on board. If the weather is clear and you have a clear shot to the ground, an absolutely massive mammoth in the Rockies or the Yukon region is going to look like nothing but a tiny brown speck on a landscape full of brown and gray specks. So we can take that one off the board, absolutely. The other one, which is made up of the smaller 1 to 2 engine, low altitude kind of commuter planes, the pontoon planes, a few hunters or trappers here and there being flown in and out. These are very few and far between. Even they would struggle to see something with the naked eye. They'd have to be in the right place at the right time, looking in the right region. And the air traffic over these absolutely massive swaths of land is simply very low. The rates of air traffic here are almost non-existent. Now, I try to be perfectly open about the perspective I come at this from, because everyone has their own preconceived notions of the world, of history, of science, and their own ideologies and biases that they bring to the table, and I'm no exception to that. There are two predominant competing views of history: evolution and some form of creation, whether this be the form accepted by Christians, Islamists, Jews, you name it. Evolution says that mammoths and mastodons died out likely no less than 10,000 years ago. Creationist theories leave the door wide open for mammoths to be surviving in the corners of the world up until recent history and potentially even today. Even if we're to take worldviews and ideologies out of the equation, we tend to see two competing camps. One camp is made up of First Nations individuals, trappers, hunters, hikers, soldiers, and explorers. They say the mammoths are, or at least recently were, out there. The other group is made up of lab coats, tenured professors, and individuals who made their homes in cities and found their occupations in universities long after the surrounding regions had been tamed and settled by the former group. Here, I think the choice is clear. I find value in both groups, but if I'm to place trust in one above the other, I'm with the First Nations and the adventurers, the men and women who lived in and on the land, who see firsthand the places and creatures they discuss. If you disagree, that's entirely fine. This video, though, is made more directly in honor of and for consumption by those who aspire to follow in the footsteps of the former group. There is one critical response I want to address right now. It's the response that these creatures, which are talked about and described and even drawn by individuals who don't seem to have any reason that they should be able to talk about and draw these creatures accurately. Critics like to point out that the most likely scenario in their mind is that bones of these creatures, which have been found throughout North America, were likely found by explorers and First Nations individuals and the like, and that through those bones they were then described as being these giant beings and potentially even drawn correctly. I don't see that as being very likely. If you look at the skeleton of a mammoth or an elephant in general, the idea that from that skeleton, and this is assuming that you found a skeleton which was 100% still intact, which is highly, highly unlikely. The idea that from that skeleton then you could accurately reconstruct without extensive scientific knowledge what a mammoth would have looked like with skin and hair on it, what its nose and ears might have looked like, the fact that it had long shaggy hair, the approximate amount of muscle and fat that it would have stored so that its proportions are drawn in a generally correct manner. These ideas, I think, kind of fall apart once you start considering that claim. So the other option then is that some completely perfectly well-preserved mammoths were preserved in ice caps, which again, we found some pretty well-preserved mammoths in ice, but they're rare and they're hard to find, and we've only found a handful of them using our modern methods. Again, I think we run into a problem where we're then assuming that multiple groups of First Nations individuals, multiple Western explorers and trappers and hunters all managed to view these well-preserved specimens, and none of them ever mentioned that they were indeed just a well-preserved specimen in ice. I think that that's a pretty thin story. Additionally, you have things like how they behaved, the fact that they release mighty roars, or what we would call bugling or the trumpeting of an elephant. These are things that you couldn't guess by something simply being in ice. And as we know, there are many animals which are essentially silent and don't roar at all. If it's not already very clear where I stand, I believe that mammoths or mastodons did indeed live up until recent history and potentially in some of the more rural regions and corners of the world even today. That's all for today, everyone. Have a great one.